The Guide to Goals podcast gives you the tools, direction, and resources you need to pursue your passion project. I'm Debra Eckerling, Project Catalyst, and this is the Guide to Goals podcast. Our guest today is Patsy Moore, and we're going to talk about the creative process. Patsy is a creative multi-hyphenate and frequent maker of small things that customarily explore big ideas. She's the author of Things I've Come to Realize in the Past Few Days and host of the Creation Files podcast. Welcome, Patsy. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Did I miss anything about your background? Do you want to share anything else?
I think you hit all the highlights. Yeah.
Well, you've done a lot of different things. I've been looking into you, girl.
Uh-oh.
And I think one of the things that, a lot about because you've got a huge musical background and you've released albums and this book, and I think the whole small things that explore big ideas, where did you come up with that?
It's just the truth. I'm always tinkering in some creative endeavor, and that's been the case since I was a very small child. The projects that I do, particularly, I had a major label record deal for 5 years. Back in the early 90s, I was signed to Warner Brothers. But since that time, all of the things I've released musically, I've done as an independent. And so, as is the case with a lot of indie art, the projects are small, and the followings of those projects are not necessarily huge, but loyal, thankfully. They're small, intimate projects. The film that I create, the music that I create, the books that I write, they're small, they're intimate, they're conversational, and yet I do think that they take on topics that are sort of these big existential queries that we all have.
You don't have to think big to be big or have big ideas. It goes back to like the kernel, right?
Right. Exactly. Exactly.
And so what is I love this topic too, the creative process. So
Mm.
what is your creative process, and what thoughts do you have for others who are like struggling to get in tune with their own?
For the longest while, I felt almost fraudulent. I would sit on these panels and for songwriters, and inevitably someone would say, "What's your process? What's your writing process?" And I didn't have a formal process, and oftentimes I was the only person on the panel who didn't. I felt like my process was very stream of consciousness. I knew that I was actively creative for most of my life, prolifically creative. But I didn't have a way of saying, these are the 5 steps, these are the 7 steps. I just knew that I was always engaged in this way. And the interesting thing that's happened to me of late, since February of this year, I've been writing and hosting and co-producing a podcast that deals with creative process. And what I've recognized is it's the subtitle of it is The Stuff Behind the Making of Stuff. And each week, each Monday, we examine some small thing, or maybe not so small thing, that is a necessary component of creative output. And what I've discovered in having to explore these things very specifically in a very detailed way is that I do have a process.
Cool.
It's just such a natural way of being for me that I never considered that that's what it was. So I think a lot of the things we're talking about on that podcast are actually things that I recognize in my own life and that have contributed to my being able to create and to be prolific in creating. I'm a naturally curious person. I think curiosity factors in heavily. I am someone who is a self-starter. I don't really require at all any sort of external motivation to do the thing and to be excited about the thing. The actual doing of the thing itself provides great excitement and fulfillment for me. I am someone who seems to move very easily into what's identified as flow state, and this idea of being in the moment. I think my spiritual practice is really helpful in that way, about just being present and meditative and focused in each of the things that I do throughout the day. And when you live your life in that way, every single thing around you becomes fodder for your artwork, fodder for your writing. When you pay attention, you realize that, all sorts of exciting subject matter is swirling around us all the time.
It's true. I mean, and it's whether you're inside meditating and then creating something, or even if you're out people watching, or looking at the sky, right?
Right.
If you're tuned into being creative, it's kind of everywhere, right?
It's absolutely everywhere. And it's, there's formal meditation. There's this whole idea that you sit and all those things that happen in various meditative practice. But there are many things we do in our day-to-day lives that themselves can be meditative practice if we allow them to be. I mean, washing the dishes sometimes for me, just really paying attention to every single stroke of the dish and the sound of the water and the feel of the soap. All of those things, if you allow yourself to really be present and really in the moment, everything can be meditative practice.
So it's kind of like, you know how everybody says they've got their best ideas when they're in the shower? Is
Yeah,
that because they're not trying to have ideas in the shower?
there you go. There you go. Like, you can't force it. And I will tell you that anything I've ever made where I was really agendized about it and really purposefully trying to make something cool tended to be horrible, actually. Just, I like seamless. I like the stuff where you can't see the seams. And when you're working so hard to be clever and to make something important, it often just falls flat. When you give yourself over to the thing and you let it tell you what it wants to be, that's where the best work, comes from.
So basically, what you're saying is don't force it, but put yourself in a position to create.
Absolutely. Put yourself in a position at all times to receive this information that's, floating around for all of us. It's just waiting for us to get still and recognize it and say, "Oh yeah, I'll do that. I'll be the vehicle through which this thing enters the world."
Now, at some point, you have to take your creativity and I don't want to say make it into something, but make it into something. You're creative, you write a book, you have to get it out to the universe. You do a podcast. It's a creative process, but you do have to, put all the different pieces together and upload or whatever, or write notes, which I do for this podcast. So, what do you do to bridge the creative and the stuff that has to get done to send your creative out for others to enjoy?
I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine yesterday. He's a photographer. He's a brilliant photographer, and he was talking about, the great joy he has when he's photographing versus the drag it is for him to have to market his work, to have to be commercial. And we were talking about that. And as an independent, I have to do a lot of self-marketing, and I don't enjoy it, honestly. But the thing I said to him is what I'm learning is to treat that part of the equation creatively as well. To not see it as something outside of the creative process, but to just see it as another opportunity to be creative. And so when I start thinking of creative ways to market and creative ways to get these things out in front of people, there's a bliss to be found in that too. It feels like a natural extension of the thing that's been made versus something that's, at loggerheads with it.
And do you have an example of something that was like eek, and then you found a creative way to approach it for your marketing?
It can be the simplest thing. The most recent thing, the thing that pops into my mind right now is um, I have a book that I wrote a couple of years ago. It finally came out last year, and I had sent a few early copies out to not just to reviewers, but to friends just to get feedback. And one of the friends took a really funny photo of himself reading the book with this expression on his face like, "Oh my God, I can't believe how great this is," and sent it to me just as a personal thing. And I thought, oh, that's fun. Well, during the course of the week, 2 or 3 other people did this too. They had no communication with each other. I didn't solicit the photos from them. They were just doing it to show me, here I am, now in this age where people photograph every single aspect of their lives,
Mm-hmm.
you were just sending me a photo of themselves reading the book. And it occurred to me, you know what? These are sort of natural responses to this book. Why can't this be the marketing campaign? Why can't we just have a way in which I come up with sort of amusing ways to describe the different people, tell a little story about them at the same time, making the public aware that this book is out there. And so we had for a couple of weeks through social media these photos that would be posted of these people with the book, and this little blurb that you know. In the case of a friend of mine who's a broadcast journalist, he's a newsman for CBS in New York. It was announced as, here's things I've come to realize for the past few days, uh, uh, being read by adorable CBS News correspondent since 2015. And each person had their own blurb like that. It was something that told a little bit about the person who was holding the book. And then it kind of also made an announcement that the book was there. And it really felt like just a fun thing to do on Facebook and Twitter. But it was hugely successful. People loved this idea that every day they would get to meet some person they didn't know, reading this book that they hadn't read. And it became sort of this unwitting marketing campaign. So it's just, always looking for opportunities to do something that doesn't feel stiff and programmed and done to death.
I think that's the thing too. The reason someone would do a passion project is because it's something that they love.
Right.
So to approach the tasks not as pain, but as, oh, this is another way to get out this passion project, this thing I love, to the universe. So it's all the approach, is what you're saying.
I think artists, and creativity certainly is not limited to artists, but my creative expression regularly takes artistic form. And I would say that we basically express artistically for two reasons. The first is just the basic human need for self-expression. It's a way of standing up on top of the mountain and shouting down into the cavern, I'm here. It's just this acknowledgement of our existence. The other half of that, though, is that we want to connect with someone down in that. We love the idea of a voice coming back up saying, oh my God, I'm here too. We like that idea of connection. We like knowing that we are not alone, and we aren't. And so I think if we can think about that when it comes time to get our work out into the world, it feels like less of a chore, and it feels like an opportunity to have the work do the thing it's meant to do in the first place, which is to connect us with other people.
Now, I have to ask you about the book title. The things I've come to realize in the past few days. So,
Yeah.
Was that just, it came through your process, or you're
It
like,
was so, I mean, at this point, I hate even saying things are random or accidental. I think they just happen when they're supposed to. There was a Monday morning when, for what felt like no apparent reason, I got up, I was checking Facebook before I went on with my day. And that the little Facebook prompt says, what's on your mind, or what are you thinking? And I wrote down a list of 3 things that had been sort of aha moments for me in the preceding week. And I titled it Things I've Come to Realize in the Past Few Days. And I listed these 3 things. And then I logged out of Facebook and I went on with my day. And that evening when I logged back in, I had this crazy number of people who were in the thread for that status update saying, oh my gosh, blah, 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 telling their own stories or agreeing or asking for more detail on one of the items. And I thought, how weird that got that much of a response. It felt like such an off-the-cuff thing to me. And the next thing I knew, I really don't remember having a moment that I sat down and said, I'm going to make this a regular thing. But what started happening was on Sundays, if the week before had been an epiphany week for me, I would post one of these lists, and they tended to have 5 items on them. And they became really, really popular. And people started reaching out to me off of Facebook. They were sending me inbox messages where they were sending me emails and telling me their own stories in the event that it was something that resonated, but they didn't feel comfortable sharing in the public forum. And I thought, oh my gosh, we're all going through this. There is no experience I'm having that someone else isn't having. And if I'm willing to be vulnerable, if I'm willing to say, here's my story, here's where I screwed up this week, or here's where I got it right this week, that is helpful to someone. As insignificant as it may feel to me, it's not. This is the stuff of our lives, and this is the stuff of connection. And so after about 4 or 5 months of doing those regularly, people started asking me, would you put these into a book? And I didn't want yet another project on my plate. I had a lot going on, and I said, I can't, maybe, but I'm not feeling compelled. And then a few more months passed, and I thought, maybe I should do this. I could split them up into volumes. And so volume 1 is the one that's out now. And I'm really grateful for how well received it is and how helpful it appears to be for people. But I do think, as I say in the foreword to the book, I think that has much less to do with me than it has to do with all of us really just wanting to know that we're not alone and that someone gets it,
And it all kind of ties back into what we started talking about at the beginning.
Right.
Your creativity and your process and the way you live your life, the little things connect to other people. So you basically live what you say, right?
I absolutely hope so. That is my aspiration. Yeah.
And so I always ask the work-life balance question, but do you have balance or do you just have this great flow between everything?
I am really happy to say that my life is at a place where it's just that flow state, and that I don't really know what the separation is between work and life. I think my life is just an ongoing series of creative opportunities and adventures. And they're not relegated to the things I do as an artist. I feel like my whole life is sort of taking that form. So yeah, that, I feel balanced in that. But there's, it's not that I have a small production company, and my partner in that company has a day job that, so there's 8 hours that she's spending doing something that she isn't passionate about, but that helps to pay the bills. And I see more of that struggle going on with her of, how to carve out the time to really be in that zone that she desires to be in and all of that. But I feel very fortunate at this time in my life to not have that particular struggle.
In a main reason I do this podcast is it is for the people who have the day job but want to create something for themselves, or if they're entrepreneurs that want to build their business, these are things that they can do, little projects that help elevate. So in theory, your business partner is one of the types that this is for, because she might not be in it forever. At least that's the hope, right? To build something big enough to move over. So what do you say, any final words of wisdom before we go into the goals for our audience? Someone who's struggling to get in touch with their creativity, do you have an exercise or?
I think the most important thing is to not. I find that a lot of people who say to let me just say this: when the whole impetus for the podcast was that as an artist, my whole life I've had people who are non-artists ask me questions like, "How do you do that? Like where does a song come from?" Or like, "Well, how do you even know how to write X, Y, and Z?" And I came to recognize that many times they weren't really asking for a primer. They weren't asking for a point by a bulleted list of things to do to write a song. I realized what they were really asking me is, how do you rouse your inner creative? Because I think there's something in all of us that recognizes that lives in us, and people feel like I don't know how to tap into that. But one of the things that I think is a huge deterrent is many people don't tap into it because they they don't see it as their birthright, as part of literally as part of a creative universe. They see it as that thing that creative people do. The reality is our truest nature, all of us, is creativity, right? We are microcosms of a perpetually creating cosmos. And so I would say the first step to being able to step into your creativity is to give yourself permission to be creative, to actually, because everything starts in your thought life. Tell yourself until you actually can believe it that you are a creative being, even if there is nothing right there immediately in front of you that you can point to as this thing I created. Know that every thought that you have, every idea that you have, the idea on how to save money on cable, every single thing is a form of creativity. So first acknowledge your innate creativity. And once you can acknowledge that and be grateful for it, you open up the space to create bigger and, better.
That's wonderful. Okay, this is great because it will lead us into our goals of the week. And usually I'll divide it into personal and professional, but I think we're just going to do like 3 goals. The first one is to do that affirmation that you're creative.
Yes.
If that is not already part of who you are. I think the second one is something you mentioned earlier, is the next time you do a mundane task like laundry or washing dishes or dusting, to do it in a very intentional way and let your mind grasp into that and see what comes of it.
Yes.
And then the third is to, I love brainstorming, brainstorm a list of like 10 things you can do creatively to market the thing that you are creating.
I love it.
Okay. Sound good?
Sounds fantastic.
Well, this has been so much fun. We've been speaking with Patsy Moore, host of the Creation Files podcast and author of Things I've Come to Realize in the Past Few Days, and all-around multi-hyphenate creator, I guess is the the very, very short, long version. And you can go to guidedgoals.com to get the show notes, and there'll be some links, and also learn more about guided goals and how that can help you take the leap outside of the life you have and bring you closer to the life you want. Because especially when I love what you said about we're all creative, we just don't see it as creativity.
Yep.
And I think the awareness of that, so we'll add that as an extra double secret bonus goal, is as you're doing things, realize how creative they are, because you're right, it's everything. It's, I've got a wobbly leg on this table. What creative thing do I have to do to make it stand up straight? It's that simple, right?
It's that simple.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Patsy Moore, for joining us today, and anybody who is listening or watching. And you have some great goals to go out and tap into your creativity. So go on out there and go for it.